Our HOA president stood in that courtroom and called my blind son's need for tactile markers special treatment, while smirking at the judge. She had no idea I was holding the recording of her saying, "The blind kid should live somewhere with the rest of the handicapped." When that audio played, her face turned ghost white, and the entire courtroom gasped. The $175,000 judgment wasn't even the worst part for her. It was watching her real estate license get suspended on the spot as I locked eyes with her from across the room. HOAs think they're untouchable until they mess with the wrong family, especially when that family is willing to fight for justice. What happened next changed disability rights across our entire state and gave my son back his dignity. My name is Robert Mitchell, a 62-year-old retired engineer. And 2 years ago, my wife Sarah and I moved with our son Jason to what we thought would be our forever home in Lakeside Estates, an upscale community with manicured lawns and a clubhouse that looked like something out of a luxury resort brochure. After 40 years of working and saving, we finally had our dream home, only to discover we'd have to fight for our son's right to navigate it independently. Jason wasn't always blind. When he was 15, he was diagnosed with Stargardt disease after a routine eye exam revealed concerns about rapid changes to his retina. By 17, he had lost most of his central vision, with only peripheral sight remaining. The doctor's words still echo in my mind. "Your son will likely be legally blind within months." Now, at 19, Jason navigates the world with remarkable resilience despite his disability. Our world turned upside down overnight. We sold our 2-story home and searched for a single-level house in a safe community. Jason, despite his condition, was extraordinary, a student who refused to let his diminishing sight dim his spirit. We worked with specialists who taught him mobility techniques, how to use assistive technology, and helped him develop the independence that every teenager craves. Max, his golden retriever service dog, became Jason's eyes and companion, specially trained to help navigate obstacles and provide stability on stairs. The bond between them was immediate and powerful. When we first moved to Lakeside Estates, our neighbors seemed genuinely welcoming. The Patels brought over homemade samosas, the Johnsons invited us to their pool party, and several neighbors even offered to drive Jason to school activities if needed. For the first time since Jason's diagnosis, we felt hopeful about the future. We had no idea we'd just moved into a battleground. 6 months after moving in, Jason was becoming more confident navigating our neighborhood with Max. But certain areas remained challenging, particularly the community walkways that connected our home to the clubhouse, pool, and mailboxes. After consulting with Dr. Williams, Jason's mobility specialist from the Center for Visual Rehabilitation, I installed small tactile markers along the edges of the concrete walkways, textured strips that allowed Jason to use his cane to feel pathway boundaries. The modification cost less than $200 and was barely visible unless you were looking for it. 3 days later, I found a violation notice taped to our door, printed in bold red letters. Unauthorized modifications to common areas. Immediate removal required. It demanded removal within 7 days and referenced covenant section 7.3.2, prohibiting alterations to community property. I immediately drafted a detailed email to the HOA board, explaining Jason's condition, attaching Dr. Williams' recommendation letter, and citing the Fair Housing Act's provisions for reasonable accommodations. I included photos showing how minimally visible the modifications were. The response came from Karen Whitfield, the HOA president, a 45-year-old former real estate agent known for her meticulous enforcement of community standards and immaculate blonde bob. Her email was coldly professional but unmistakably dismissive. While we sympathize with your son's condition, Lakeside Estates prides itself on aesthetic consistency and property value preservation. The board cannot approve modifications that alter the visual harmony of our community spaces. Perhaps you could accompany your son when he wishes to use these areas or consider alternative transportation methods. I was stunned. Did she really suggest that a 19-year-old should be accompanied by his parents everywhere? I immediately responded with specific citations from the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act, emphasizing that reasonable accommodations were legally required. not optional. Karen's reply cut deeper. Lakeside Estates is well-versed in fair housing laws. These modifications were not approved through proper channels and must be removed. Our attorney has advised us that our covenants take precedence in this matter. A week later, we received a second violation notice, this time with a $100 fine and a threat of additional $50 daily penalties. That evening, I found Jason sitting in the dark in his room, headphones on, unusually quiet. "Dad," he said when I sat down beside him, "I overheard Mrs. Whitfield talking to another woman at the mailboxes today. She called me the blind kid causing all the trouble. Max heard her too." He started growling. His voice cracked slightly. "Maybe we should just remove those markers. I don't want to cause problems for us." My heart shattered. My son was willing to sacrifice his independence because he felt unwelcome in his own neighborhood. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I started documenting every interaction with the HOA board, including installing a legal voice recorder in my pocket during all future meetings. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week in the community clubhouse. I arrived early, recorder discreetly activated in my jacket pocket, armed with documentation about reasonable accommodations and photocopies of relevant federal laws for each board member. 20 neighbors attended, more than usual, several offering supportive nods as I took my seat. When my turn came to speak, I had barely explained Jason's condition when Karen interrupted, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she waved dismissively. "Mr. Mitchell, we're all very sorry about the blind kid's challenges, but rules are rules," she said, the phrase blind kid dripping with condescension. "If we start making exceptions, where do we draw the line? Next, someone will want bright purple handrails or flashing lights on walkways." And frankly, Karen added, adjusting her perfectly styled blonde hair with a dismissive flick, "we've also received multiple complaints about that dog of yours running loose in the common areas. Another clear violation of our standards." An older gentleman in the back muttered, "Let the man speak, Karen," earning a sharp glare from the HOA president. I continued calmly. "The Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing Act both protect the rights of disabled residents to reasonable modifications. These tactile strips are virtually invisible." Karen cut me off again. "This is not a public facility, Mr. Mitchell. This is a private community with covenants that you agreed to when you purchased your home. The board has made its decision." I looked at the other board members, Tom Reynolds, a retired accountant, Maria Gonzalez, who worked at the local hospital, Steve Brennan, who owned a hardware store downtown, and Judith Miller, who taught at the community college. Tom and Maria avoided eye contact, looking down at their papers. Steve and Judith exchanged uncomfortable glances. "That's absolutely false," I responded, my calm facade starting to crack. "Max is never unleashed outside our fenced yard. He's a certified service animal for my son's disability, and service animals are exempt from pet restrictions under federal law." Karen's smile never reached her eyes. "We'll need to see proper certification documentation. And in the meantime, those walkway modifications need to be removed." As I returned to my seat, I noticed several neighbors shaking their heads in disapproval. Not at me, but at Karen's handling of the situation. That evening, I contacted Michael Chong, a disability rights attorney who had successfully challenged discriminatory housing practices across 3 states. After reviewing our documentation, his assessment was blunt. They're violating federal law, and based on the language they're using, I suspect this isn't their first time. The tactile markers are textbook reasonable accommodation. We should file a formal complaint. Meanwhile, Jason's anxiety manifested physically. He developed insomnia and began eating lunch alone in the school library rather than the cafeteria. "I just feel like everyone's staring at me," he confessed, "like I'm that troublemaker kid from Lakeside Estates." That weekend, a small act of solidarity appeared. Mrs. Patel from 2 doors down brought over homemade cookies and quietly informed us that several neighbors had spoken up at the board's closed executive session, questioning Karen's handling of our request. "She didn't take it well," Mrs. Patel whispered. "Be careful. She holds grudges." 2 weeks later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, came the incident that pushed us past the point of no return. Jason had decided to try walking to the community mailboxes independently, with Max guiding him. The route included a short set of concrete steps connecting our street to the lower level where the mailboxes were located, steps that had no tactile warning strip at the top, something I had specifically requested in my accommodation application. I was on a work video call when I heard Max barking frantically outside. Telling my colleagues I had an emergency, I rushed out to find Jason sprawled at the bottom of those steps, his knee bleeding through torn jeans, his hands scraped raw from trying to catch himself. His white cane had snapped in half from the impact. I couldn't tell where the top step began, Jason explained, fighting back tears as I helped him up. I thought I had another foot before the drop. A small crowd of neighbors began gathering, several rushing over to help. Mrs. Johnson ran to get her first aid kit, while Mr. Patel helped me steady Jason. That's when Karen appeared, surveying the scene with a clipboard in hand. She had been doing her weekly compliance inspections. "This is exactly why common areas shouldn't be modified," she announced loudly. "If you can't navigate safely, maybe you should live somewhere more appropriate for your situation." The collective gasp from the neighbors was audible. Mrs. Johnson, returning with her first aid kit, stopped in her tracks. "Karen, this boy is injured, and that's unfortunate," Karen replied coolly. "But our insurance doesn't cover unauthorized modifications that could create additional liability." As I helped Jason home, Mr. Patel placed a hand on my shoulder. "This has gone too far," he said quietly. "Many of us will support you if you decide to take action." The next morning, a certified letter arrived from the HOA's attorney. Not only were they enforcing the removal of our existing modifications, but they were also issuing daily fines of $200 for ongoing violations. The letter concluded with a threat to place a lien on our property if the fines remained unpaid. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. An envelope appeared in our mailbox containing a USB drive. The anonymous note simply read, "Board executive session recording. Thought you should hear this." When I played it, I heard Karen's voice clearly. "The blind kid needs to adapt to our community, not the other way around. If they don't like it, they can move back to whatever handicap-accessible place they came from." Another board member's voice asked hesitantly, "But what about the federal requirements for reasonable accommodations?" Karen's dismissive laugh sent chills down my spine. "Those are just guidelines. Nobody enforces that stuff unless it gets to court. And who has money for that? They'll back down." That evening, I sat down with Sarah and Jason to discuss our options. Michael Chong confirmed what we suspected. The HOA was in clear violation of federal law. And now, we had evidence of deliberate discrimination. "Dad, I don't want to make things worse," Jason said hesitantly, his fingers absent-mindedly running through Max's fur. "You're not making things worse," I assured him. "They're discriminating against you. And that's not just wrong, it's illegal. Sometimes you have to stand up not just for yourself, but for everyone who might face this kind of treatment." Our once peaceful neighborhood had become divided. Anonymous supportive notes appeared in our mailbox. A few neighbors brought meals or offered to drive Jason to activities. Others stopped speaking to us entirely, worried about getting on Karen's bad side. 3 families with support accessible lakeside yard signs received violation notices for unauthorized signage. Through it all, Jason showed remarkable resilience, but I could see the toll it was taking. This was his home too, and he deserved to feel safe and welcome there. Michael Chong moved with strategic precision once we decided to pursue legal action. He filed a formal discrimination complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and prepared a federal lawsuit against the Lakeside Estates, HOA, for violations of the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act. "We're not just going after them for denying the accommodation," Michael explained. "We're also citing a pattern of harassment, retaliation, and creating a hostile housing environment." The discovery phase revealed damning evidence. We obtained emails between board members discussing our case that showed not only bias, but calculated deception. In one exchange, Karen wrote, "If we make exceptions for every disability, what's next? The whole neighborhood turning into some kind of handicap facility? Property values will plummet. My commission on the Henderson sale last month would have been $3,000 less if this had happened earlier." Other emails revealed an even darker motivation. Karen had written to board member Steve, "Between us, I just don't want those people changing the character of Lakeside. My sister has a special needs kid, and the constant accommodations drain everyone around them. I moved here specifically to avoid dealing with disabilities and special requirements." Steve Brennan had responded with concern. "We need to be careful here. The ADA has some pretty strict requirements." To which Karen replied, "The ADA is for public places. We're private property. Besides, they signed the covenants. They won't fight this. The father looks like he makes decent money, but not enough for a long legal battle." Even more shocking was an email where Karen specifically instructed the property manager to apply stricter scrutiny to our maintenance and compliance. "Find something, anything we can cite them for." Sometimes people need a little extra motivation to follow the rules or move elsewhere. My meticulous documentation proved invaluable. I had saved every email, recorded dates of conversations, taken photos of the violation notices, and even had before and after videos of Jason navigating with and without the tactile markers demonstrating their necessity and minimal visual impact. An unexpected ally emerged when the property manager, Jessica Torres, contacted Michael confidentially. "I've been uncomfortable with how they've handled this from the beginning," she admitted. "They instructed me to prioritize violations at the Mitchell home. I have emails to prove it." Michael secured expert witnesses. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a nationally recognized specialist in accessibility accommodations who had consulted for the Department of Justice. Dr. James Foster, a child psychologist specializing in the psychological impact of discrimination on disabled teenagers. And Robert Jensen, a property valuation expert who could testify that accessibility modifications typically had zero negative impact on community property values. Several neighbors, including Mrs. Patel, the Johnsons, and surprisingly, Judith Miller from the HOA board itself, agreed to testify about the minimal visual impact of the modifications and the hostile atmosphere created by the board's actions. When I thanked Judith for taking such a risk, her response gave us our first taste of vindication. "I've been on 3 HOA boards in my lifetime, Mr. Mitchell, and I've never seen such blatant discrimination. Karen doesn't speak for all of us, and it's time someone said so publicly." That night, I told Jason about Judith's support. Watching his face light up with the realization that the community wasn't united against him was our first small victory. Throughout this preparation, Jason's anxiety about testifying was palpable. "What if they twist my words?" he asked one evening. "Karen is really good at making people feel stupid." "That's what preparation is for," Michael assured him, spending extra hours coaching Jason through potential cross-examination questions. "Just remember, you're not on trial here. They are." The night before court, an extraordinary show of community support manifested. Nearly 20 neighbors gathered on our front lawn, each holding a small electric candle. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward as spokesperson. "We want you to know that Karen Whitfield doesn't speak for all of us," she said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you have neighbors who believe in doing what's right." The county courthouse was imposingly formal, all polished wood and hushed voices echoing off marble floors. We arrived early, giving Jason time to familiarize himself with the layout. Michael had arranged for him to visit the empty courtroom the day before to help ease his anxiety. News of the case had spread, and a local disability rights organization had members present in support. I noticed several of our neighbors filing in, along with a reporter for the local newspaper. Karen and the HOA board members arrived as a group, all in business attire projecting confidence. Karen's designer suit and perfectly coiffed blonde hair contrasted with her cold expression. She deliberately avoided looking in our direction, whispering to their attorney with animated hand gestures. Their lawyer, Richard Blanchard, had a reputation as a ruthless litigator who specialized in defending property management companies and homeowners associations. His firm's retainer alone probably cost more than our annual property taxes. Judge Eleanor Ramirez entered, a formidable woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and piercing eyes that missed nothing. She had a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and zero tolerance for courtroom games. "Before we begin," she said, surveying both parties, "I I want to make it clear that I expect this proceeding to focus on the legal merits of the case, not community politics or personalities. I've reviewed the filings, and I expect counsel to stick to relevant facts. Blanchard presented the HOA's opening statement with smooth confidence. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about property rights and contractual obligations, he began, his voice resonating with practiced authority. The Mitchells signed legally binding covenants when they purchased their home in Lakeside Estates. These covenants exist to preserve community aesthetics and property values for all residents. He portrayed us as difficult residents who refused to work within established procedures, emphasizing that the HOA had great sympathy for Jason's condition but couldn't allow exceptions that would undermine the community's governing documents. The plaintiffs made changes to common areas without approval, then refused to work with the board on compromise solutions, he claimed. This lawsuit is an unfortunate attempt to use federal statutes to circumvent legitimate community governance. When Michael Chong rose for our opening statement, his approach was systematic and devastating. Your Honor, this case goes far beyond a dispute about property modifications, he began. The evidence will show a disturbing pattern of deliberate discrimination, retaliation, and harassment against a disabled teenager and his family. He outlined how the HOA had not merely denied reasonable accommodations, but had actively targeted our family, applying rules unequally and creating a hostile living environment. We will present evidence that the HOA board, particularly its president, didn't just misunderstand their legal obligations. They knowingly violated federal law while explicitly mocking a disabled resident's needs, he continued. Their own communications reveal they expected the financial burden of legal action would prevent this family from asserting their federally protected rights. As opening statements concluded, I noticed Judge Ramirez studying Karen with a thoughtful expression. The real test was about to begin. When Jason was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. He rose with quiet dignity, wearing his dark sunglasses that had become part of his identity. Max guided him to the front before being directed to sit beside the witness stand. Jason gripped his white cane and made the final steps to the witness box alone. Despite weeks of preparation, seeing my 19-year-old son navigate to the front of a hushed courtroom, shoulders square and chin raised despite his inability to see the faces staring at him, made my heart constrict with both overwhelming pride and lingering pain. When he took his place at the witness stand, standing tall in his gray t-shirt rather than the suit we'd offered, the judge nodded with respect at his authentic presence. Jason took his oath, his voice steady, one hand reaching down to Max, who sat perfectly still beside the witness box, the very picture of a working service animal. Michael began gently, establishing Jason's condition and daily experiences. Jason spoke articulately about Stargardt disease, explaining how his vision deteriorated in stages and how he adapted at each phase. I can still see shapes and movement in my peripheral vision, he explained. But my central vision is mostly gone, like trying to read through a thick fog with holes burned through it. Can you describe what it's like trying to navigate the community walkways without the tactile markers? Michael asked. Jason took a deep breath. It's like walking on a balance beam while blindfolded. I can use my cane to feel what's directly in front of me, but without boundary markers, I can't tell where the edge is. One wrong step, and I could be in the street or fall down an incline. It's not just physically dangerous, it's mentally exhausting. And with the markers, a small smile appeared. Freedom. I can walk confidently, knowing exactly where I am. I don't have to count steps or constantly worry. I can just be a normal teenager. From my seat, I watched Karen roll her eyes dramatically, whispering something behind her hand to another board member. Judge Ramirez caught it too, her expression hardening momentarily. When Michael asked about the falling incident, Jason described it with remarkable composure. I thought I had another step before the stairs began. By the time my cane detected the drop, I was already off balance. The fall broke my cane, and my knee was bleeding pretty badly, but the worst part was hearing Mrs. Whitfield say I should live somewhere else because of my disability. That hurt more than the fall. There was a murmur in the courtroom. Judge Ramirez called for order, her gaze lingering on Karen, who suddenly seemed very interested in her notepad. Blanchard's cross-examination began with deceptive gentleness that quickly sharpened to a point. "Mr. Mitchell, isn't it true that your father installed these modifications without obtaining proper approval first? He applied for approval as required by the HOA bylaws." Jason corrected respectfully. "But he installed them before receiving that approval, correct?" "After our doctor said they were necessary for my safety, yes." Blanchard pressed harder. "And isn't it true that your father was offered alternatives, such as having a family member accompany you in common areas?" Jason's response was measured but firm. "Sir, I'm 19. Would you want to be accompanied by your parents everywhere you went in your own neighborhood? Independence is important to everyone, especially young adults try to build their lives. So this is about what you want, not what's necessary?" Blanchard suggested. "No, sir, it's about my right to safe, independent navigation of my own community, something sighted residents take for granted every day." Blanchard switched tactics. "Have other visually impaired people managed to live in communities without such modifications?" Jason didn't hesitate. "Some have, just like some people manage to climb stairs without handrails. That doesn't make handrails unnecessary or unreasonable." The simple logic of his answer seemed to resonate with Judge Ramirez, who was watching Jason with growing respect. As Jason's testimony continued, Karen whispered to another board member, just loudly enough to be heard by those nearby, "This is all for attention. They just want special treatment and money." Michael immediately rose. "Your Honor, I'd like the record to reflect the comment just made by the HOA president." Judge Ramirez's eyes narrowed. "Ms. Whitfield, this court will not tolerate disparaging comments about witnesses, particularly minor witnesses. Consider this your only warning." Karen's face flushed crimson, but the damage was done. Her mask of reasonable authority had slipped at precisely the wrong moment. The courtroom atmosphere shifted palpably when Michael presented the email and recording evidence. He called Karen to the stand, his manner respectful but relentless. "Ms. Whitfield, I'd like you to review this email sent from your account to the HOA board on March 10th, he said, handing her a printed copy while providing others to the judge and defense counsel. Karen scanned the document, her composure visibly faltering. That was taken out of context during a difficult discussion. Please just read the highlighted portion," Judge Ramirez instructed firmly. Karen cleared her throat. "If we make exceptions for every disability, what's next? The whole neighborhood turning into some kind of handicap facility? Property values will plummet. My commission on the Henderson sale would have been $3,000 less if this had happened earlier." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "And this text message you sent to board member Thomas Clark on April 3rd. Michael continued, presenting another document. "Could you read that as well?" Karen's hands trembled slightly. "Dealing with the blind kid situation again. These people need to understand this isn't a public park. Maybe they should live somewhere with the rest of the handicap." Judge Ramirez's expression darkened. "Ms. Whitfield, are you a licensed real estate agent?" "Yes, Your Honor." "But you're familiar with fair housing laws as part of your professional obligations?" "Generally, yes." "Generally," the judge repeated, the single word hanging in the air like a verdict. Michael then produced the most damaging evidence, the audio recording from the board's executive session. "Your Honor, we'd like to play this recording obtained from the HOA's executive session meeting on April 10th. As Karen's voice filled the courtroom. "The blind kid needs to adapt to our community, not the other way around." The color drained from her face. When her dismissive laugh played following the question about federal requirements. "Those are just guidelines. Nobody enforces that stuff unless it gets to court. And who has money for that?" "They'll back down." Several jurors visibly recoiled. "Ms. Whitfield," Michael asked when the recording ended, "is that your voice on this recording?" After a long pause, she whispered yes. "And were you aware that the Fair Housing Act carries potential penalties of up to $100,000 for willful violations?" "Objection," Blanchard interjected. "Counsel is testifying." "Sustained," Judge Ramirez ruled, but her expression suggested the damage was done. Michael then presented a series of photographs showing various modifications throughout the community that had been approved by the HOA. Decorative fountains, elaborate landscaping, even bright colored house numbers and mailbox posts. So these modifications were deemed acceptable, but small tactile strips to help a blind teenager navigate safely were not. Michael asked. Those were different circumstances, Karen stammered. Different how exactly? Because they weren't requested by a family with a disabled member. The evidence continued to mount when Jessica Torres, the property manager, testified about receiving explicit instructions to scrutinize our property more strictly than others. Ms. Whitfield told me to, and I quote, find anything we can cite them for shortly after Mr. Mitchell requested the accessibility accommodations, she testified, presenting emails that corroborated her statement. Dr. Elena Rodriguez testified next, explaining the minimal nature of the requested accommodations and their crucial importance for visually impaired individuals. These modifications would cost approximately $200 to install, will be virtually unnoticeable to sighted residents, and would prevent exactly the kind of accident that Jason experienced, she explained, showing side-by-side photos. In my 20 years of consulting on accessibility accommodations, I've rarely seen a more straightforward case of reasonable accommodation. Perhaps most devastating was the testimony of Judith Miller, the HOA board member who had broken ranks. I voted against denying the accommodation because it seemed wrong, she explained quietly. After the vote, I expressed concerns about potential legal liability, and Mrs. Whitfield told me not to worry because, and I quote, they don't have the money or stomach for a legal fight. They'll give up and move. As testimony continued, the HOA's case visibly crumbled. Blanchard attempted damage control, arguing technicalities about approval processes and property rights, but the underlying discrimination had been laid bare. Judge Ramirez grew increasingly direct in her questioning, particularly when board members contradicted themselves or tried to justify their decisions with vague references to community standards and aesthetic considerations. Can you point to any section in your governing documents that would prohibit an accommodation required under federal law? She asked one flustered board member. His inability to answer spoke volumes. After 3 days of testimony, both sides presented their closing arguments. Blanchard emphasized procedural technicalities and the HOA's right to enforce its covenants, while Michael focused on the clear pattern of discrimination and the legal requirements under federal law. When Judge Ramirez returned with her ruling, the courtroom was packed with neighbors, disability advocates, local media, and even representatives from the state attorney general's office. In the case of Mitchell versus Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. This court finds overwhelmingly in favor of the plaintiff. She methodically outlined her reasoning, citing specific violations of the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act. Her voice grew particularly stern when addressing the HOA's conduct. The evidence presented demonstrates not merely a misunderstanding of legal obligations, but a pattern of deliberate discrimination against a disabled resident. The defendant's own communications reveal bias and retaliatory intent that has no place in housing decisions. The judgment was comprehensive and unprecedented for our county. The HOA was ordered to immediately approve all requested accommodations and pay damages totaling $175,000 to $25,000 for violations of federal law and $150,000 in punitive damages. Additionally, Judge Ramirez continued, Lakeside Estates HOA is ordered to create and implement a comprehensive accessibility policy in consultation with qualified specialists within 90 days. All board members must complete ADA and fair housing compliance training, and certification of this training must be filed with this court. She issued a permanent injunction against removing any of the accessibility modifications and ordered the HOA to conduct a full assessment of community areas for additional accessibility needs. Furthermore, she added, the court is referring this matter to the State Real Estate Commission for review of Ms. Whitfield's professional license, as the evidence suggests violations of licensing requirements regarding fair housing compliance. Karen sat frozen, her face drained of color as the implications sank in. Not just financial penalties for the HOA, but potential consequences for her real estate career. Then Judge Ramirez did something remarkable. She addressed Jason directly. "Young man, this court wishes to apologize for the treatment you've endured. Your dignity and composure throughout these proceedings speak to your character. You have every right to safe, independent access to your community, and this court affirms that right unequivocally." Looking directly at Karen, she added, "It would serve the defendants well to recognize that accommodating disabilities doesn't diminish a community. It enriches it by ensuring all residents can participate fully in community life." As the ruling concluded, the other board members visibly distanced themselves from Karen, several avoiding eye contact with her entirely. The reporter from the local paper was already typing furiously on his phone, and I knew by evening the story would be all over town. Outside the courtroom, supporters gathered around Jason. The president of the local disability rights organization shook his hand, saying loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You've done more for accessibility rights in this county than years of advocacy. Thank you for your courage." Jason, standing tall with Max at his side, responded with unexpected poise, "I just wanted to be able to walk safely in my own neighborhood. But if this helps others, that makes everything worthwhile." The aftermath was swift and transformative. Karen resigned from the HOA board within 48 hours, replaced by Mrs. Patel, who immediately established an accessibility committee with Jason as a youth advisor. The tactile markers were installed throughout the community within a week, along with additional accommodations, textured warnings before steps, improved lighting on walkways, and clear signage with high-contrast lettering. The story made headlines beyond our local paper, picked up by regional news and disability rights publications. The State Attorney General's office launched an investigation into similar complaints against HOAs throughout the county, using our case as a precedent. 6 months after our case, the governor signed the Jason Mitchell Act, requiring all HOAs in the state to establish clear accessibility accommodation policies. What surprised us most was the letter that arrived from an elderly couple 3 states away. "We've been fighting our HOA for a wheelchair ramp for 2 years," they wrote. "After showing them your case, they approved it the next day. Your son's courage changed our lives." For Jason, the victory brought more than just physical accessibility. It transformed him. The shy teenager who had begun to doubt his place in the world stepped into an unexpected role as an advocate. He was invited to speak at the local high school about disability rights, and started mentoring younger visually impaired students through a support group at the Regional Vision Center. "Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone who comes after you," he told me one evening. I get that now. 3 years later, Jason is now studying pre-law at State University with a focus on civil rights and disability law. Max still accompanies him everywhere, though now sporting distinguished gray around his muzzle. Jason's dorm room features the framed court order, a daily reminder of the battle they won together. The university recently selected him for a prestigious internship with the Department of Justice's Disability Rights Division, the same division that now uses our case as a training example. As for Lakeside Estates, it underwent a remarkable transformation. Under new leadership, it became known as one of the most inclusive communities in the county. The accessibility features that Karen once claimed would destroy property values actually increased home values by 7% over the next 2 years as the community gained recognition for its inclusive design. 3 more visually impaired families have moved into the neighborhood, drawn by its reputation for accessibility. Karen not only lost her position on the board, but the State Real Estate Commission suspended her license for 6 months and required extensive fair housing training. She moved away shortly after the trial, facing both professional consequences and community backlash. The other board members apologized privately to our family, admitting they should have spoken up sooner. The most meaningful outcome wasn't the money, which we largely donated to disability advocacy organizations after covering our legal expenses. It was watching our community transform from a battleground to a model of inclusion. The annual block party now features an accessibility awareness component where residents can experience navigating with a blindfold and cane to better understand their neighbors' experiences. Last year, the mayor presented our neighborhood with the Community Inclusion Award, with Jason accepting the honor. Sometimes justice isn't just about winning in court. It's about changing hearts and minds. If you're facing discrimination from your HOA or any housing authority, remember that the law stands firmly on the side of reasonable accommodations. No homeowners association is above federal law, and no one should be made to feel unwelcome in their own home because of a disability. As Jason told the local paper in a recent interview, accessibility isn't special treatment, it's equal access. And that's something worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the opposition seems. Standing up against discrimination isn't just about winning a legal battle. It's about creating communities where everyone belongs. As I watch my son preparing for law school today, I'm reminded that sometimes the most important fights aren't just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. The HOA thought they were untouchable. They were wrong.